Chapter 30 of The Mine with the Iron Door by Harold Bell Wright. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Pardners Still. Every day he spent the greater part of his time under the mesquite trees with Bob, and in the night they would hear him going out to see, as he said, if his partner was all right. In the Cañada del Oro, Dr. Burton and his mother watched beside the old prospector and the wounded Mexican. The man who had been so heartlessly abandoned by his outlaw leader did not speak, but his eyes, like the eyes of a wounded animal, followed every movement of St. Jimmy and Mother Burton. But as the days and nights of suffering passed, and he received nothing but the gentlest and most attentive care from the two good Samaritans into whose hands he had fallen, the expression of suspicion and fear which had at first marked his every glance gave way to a look of wondering and pathetic gratitude. It was late in the afternoon of that first day following the tragedy, when Thad regained consciousness. St. Jimmy, who was at the bedside when the sturdy old prospector looked up at him with a smile of recognition, said cheerfully, "Good morning, neighbor. How are you? Had a good sleep?" There was the suggestion of a twinkle in those faded blue eyes as Thad returned, "There ain't no need for you to pretend none with me, Doc. I come to quite a spell back. Got a peek at you, though, first thing when you weren't lookin', and I just naturally shut my eyes again quick. I've been layin' here, figuring things out. Got 'em about figured, I reckon." His leathery, wrinkled old face twisted into a grimace of pain, and his gray lips quivered as he added, "They got my gal, didn't they?" St. Jimmy returned gravely, "You must be careful not to excite yourself, Thad. You have had a dangerous injury." "Holy cats! You don't need to think this is the first time I ever been knocked out. My old head is tougher than you know. You don't need to worry about me getting rattled neither. I tell you I know what happened up to the time that half-Mex devil hit me with his gun. I know they must have got her, or she would have been settin' right here, certain sure. Tell me." "Yes, they took her away, but Hugh, Edwards, and Natchitoches are on their trail." "What time did the boys start after them?" "About noon." "Good enough. They won't throw the engine off, and him and Hugh will be able to handle them if they ain't too many." "There are only two with Marta, Sonora, Jack, and the Lizard." "The Lizard, you say? Is he in on this deal, too?" "Yes." "Huh! I always knowed he'd do some real meanness if he ever worked up nerve enough. That made three of them, then." "Yes. I got one of them, didn't I?" "Yes. He is lying in the other room." "Pretty sick, is he?" "He is going to die, Thad." "Uh-huh. That's what I expected him to do when I took a shot at him." The old prospector looked at Dr. Burton appealingly, as if there was another question which he longed yet dreaded to ask. St. Jimmy evaded the unspoken question by asking, "Have you guessed who that fellow John Holt really is, Thad?" "He certain sure ain't no decent prospector, or he wouldn't be trying to carry away my gal like he's doing. That's all I know." "He is Sonora Jack, the outlaw Natchitoches found it out." "Holy cats, and I wasted a shot on a measly Mex, when I might just as well have picked the king himself first. But what do you figure he wants to carry off my gal that-a-way for?" "I wish we knew," said St. Jimmy. "Well, there ain't no good trying to guess. We'll know what we know when Natchitoches and Hugh comes back with her. But say, Doc." The old prospector hesitated, and his gaze roamed about the room. St. Jimmy swallowed a lump in his throat. "What, Thad? Why?" The gnarled fingers plucked at the bedding nervously, and the faded blue eyes at last met the eyes of the younger man with such pathetic fear that St. Jimmy's eyes filled. "Why, ain't my partner Bob here? Where is he? He didn't go with the Injun and the boy." "No, Thad. Bob did not go with you and Natchitoches." The old prospector put out his trembling hand as if to cling to St. Jimmy, and Dr. Burton caught it in both his own. They didn't get my partner. Bob ain't cashed in." St. Jimmy bowed his head. Then his mother came to the door, and the doctor willingly made an excuse to leave his patient for a little. When he returned an hour later, and Mother Burton had yielded her place to him and left the room. Old Thad smiled up at him. "That mother of yourn is a plumb wonder, sir. I always suspicioned it on account of what she's done for Marta, but I know now that I hadn't even begun to appreciate it. I reckon I'll be getting up now." "And I reckon you won't," retorted the doctor, putting out a firm hand and pushing him back on the pillow. "You'll stay right where you are until tomorrow morning. You've already talked too much. Here, let me fix the bandage. There, that will do. Now take this and turn your face to the wall, and keep quiet." The old prospector obeyed, but the next morning he was out of the house before either St. Jimmy or his mother had left their beds. When Mrs. Burton went to call him for breakfast, she found him beside the grave, under the mesquite trees. "You see, ma'am," he explained with childish confusion, "I got to imagining long in the night that my pardner Bob must be feeling all fired lonesome and left out like, with me sleeping in the house and him out here all alone. Bob and me ain't never been very far apart, you see, for a good many years now, and so I felt like he'd kind of want me round somewheres. It's funny, ain't it, how an old desert rat like me could get fussed up that away. I think maybe that Bob would feel some better too if only our gal was here. I'm plumb sure I would, but I know she'll be back all right. That Injun can hang to a trail like the smell follows a skunk, and the boy will be here too with both feet when it comes to getting her away from them again. That half Mexican the lizard won't stand a show again, Natachi and our Hugh. I wish they'd hurry back, though." "Yes, ma'am, I'm coming." "So long, pardner. I got to get my breakfast. I'll be back again directly." Every day he spent the greater part of his time under the mesquite trees with Bob, and in the night they would hear him going out to see, as he said, if his pardner was all right. It was there that Marta found him the morning of her return with Hugh and Natachi. Later, when Mother Burton had put the tired girl to bed, old Thad roamed contentedly about the place, petting Nugget and going often to the door of Marta's room to listen with a smile for any sound that would tell him the girl was awake. And that night he did not leave the house. "You see, ma'am," he explained to Mother Burton in the morning, "Bob, he's all right now that our gal is safe home again, and there ain't nobody ever going to steal her no more. It's a good thing the lizard is gone, and that the Injun done for that Sonora Jack, 'cause if they hadn't a got what was coming to 'em, I'd be obliged to take a try for them myself, old as I be. I couldn't never a looked Bob in the face again nohow, if I'd a let them hombres get away with such a job as that. But it's all right now. It's sure all right." During the forenoon of the day following Marta's return, the Mexican at last spoke to Dr. Burton, who was dressing his patient's wound. As the man spoke in his native tongue, St. Jimmy could not understand. Going to the door, he called Natachi. When the Mexican had repeated what he had said, the Indian interpreted his words for St. Jimmy. "He says he thinks he's going to die and wants to know if it is so." "Shall I tell him the truth, Natachi?" "Why not?" returned the Indian coldly. "He may have something that he wishes to say. Perhaps it is something the friends of Miss Hillgrove should know." "Tell him, then, that there is no hope for his life. Death is certain. It may come any time now." When Natachi had repeated the doctor's words in the Mexican tongue, and the dying man had replied, the Indian said, "There is something that he wants to tell. He says that you and your mother have been so kind that he will not die without speaking of the girl you both love so much. I think you should call the others. It may be in the nature of a confession. It would be well to have them." He spoke again to the Mexican, and the man answered, "Si habla le a la muchacha y sus amigos." Natachi interpreted, "Yes, call the girl and her friends." A few minutes later, Mother Burton, Thad, Hugh, Edwards, and Marta were with St. Jimmy and the Indian in the presence of the dying Mexican. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Mine with the Iron Door by Harold Bell Wright. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Mexican's Confession. It was well that no one in the room, save Natachi and the Mexican, could at that moment see St. Jimmy's face. Slowly the eyes of the Mexican turned from face to face of the silent group, but it was upon St. Jimmy's face that his gaze finally rested, and it was to St. Jimmy that he addressed himself. The Indian, as coldly impersonal and impassive as a mechanical instrument, translated. He says that you, Dr. Burton, are a man who lives very close to God. When you are near him, he can feel God. God is never far from any man, returned St. Jimmy. Natachi translated the doctor's words, and the Mexican replied in his mother tongue, which the Indian rendered in English. He says, yes, sir, that is true, but some men keep their backs toward God and refuse to see or listen to him. He says he is one who has lived with his face away from God. Tell him then to turn around. Again the Indian translated St. Jimmy's words and received the Mexican's answer. He says he sees God when he looks at you, that if you will remain with him, when he dies, he can go with his face toward God. I will not leave him, returned St. Jimmy. Tell him not to fear. When he received this message from the Indian, the man smiled and made the sign of the cross. Then he spoke again, and Natachi translated. He says to thank you, and that now he will tell you all he knows about the girl you love. It was well that no one in the room, save Natachi and the Mexican, could at that moment see St. Jimmy's face. Tell him that we are listening. With frequent pauses to gather strength or to shape the things he would say, the Mexican told his story. In those intervals, Natachi's deep voice, without a trace of feeling, made the message clear to the little company. His name is Chico Alvarez. He was a member of Sonora Jack's band of outlaws in the years when they were active here in this part of Arizona. About 20 years ago, they held up a man and a woman who were driving in a covered wagon on the road from Tucson to Yuma and California. The man and woman were killed. There was a little girl hiding in the bottom of the wagon. They did not know the baby was there when they shot the man and woman. When Sonora Jack was searching the outfit for money and valuables, he found papers and letters that told him about the little girl. She was not the child of the people who were killed. They had stolen her when she was a little baby from her real parents who lived in the East. Sonora Jack saved all the papers and letters that told about the child, but burned everything else in the outfit so that no one would know there had been a child with the man and woman. He took the baby with him. He said her parents were very rich and would pay much money to have their little girl again. The officers were close after the outlaws who were escaping to their place across the border, and Sonora Jack left the little girl with his mother, who was Mexican and lived with her man, not Jack's father, on a little ranch near the border. When Sonora Jack went back to his mother for the child, after the sheriff and his men had given up trying to catch him that time, he found that 2 prospectors had taken the little girl away. Sonora Jack dared not come again into the United States because of the reward that was offered for him, so he could not follow the prospectors, and the little girl was lost to him. Sonora Jack went south in Mexico and stayed there where he was safe. Last year, a man showed him an old Spanish map of the Cañada del Oro and the mine with the iron door. Sonora Jack and this man Chico came to find the mine. They did not find the mine, but they found again the little girl, whose people would pay so much money to have her back. Sonora Jack planned to steal the girl. He said they would take her into Mexico and keep her until her people paid much money. If it should be that her people were dead, then he and Chico would make from her enough money in another way to pay them for their trouble. That is all. The Mexican closed his eyes wearily. St. Jimmy spoke quickly. Ask him what became of the things that told about the little girl's parents and how she was stolen from them. The Indian spoke to the man and received his reply. He says, I do not know. Sonora Jack, he will always keep those things for himself. Hugh Edwards cried hoarsely, but the name, Natachi, ask him the name. The dying Mexican opened his eyes as the Indian, bending over him, repeated the question. He answered, Eso nunca me dio Sonora Jack, and with a look toward St. Jimmy, sank into unconsciousness. Natachi faced toward that little company of agitated listeners. He says Sonora Jack never did tell me that. Mother Burton led Marta from the room. Old Thad, muttering to himself, followed. Dr. Burton turned from the bedside, saying quietly, "It is all over. He is gone." Natalie spoke. "You, Dr. Burton, and you, Hugh Edwards, wait here for me. The others will not come again into this room for a little while. Wait, I will come back in a moment." The Indian left the room. Hugh Edwards and St. Jimmy looked at each other in wondering silence. When Natalie returned, he held in his hand a flat package, some 6 inches wide by 8 inches long and about an inch in thickness. The envelope was of leather, laced securely, and there were straps attached. The straps had been cut. The Indian addressed Hugh. "As I fought with Sonora Jack, did you see that when I struck his breast my knife drew no blood?" "Yes," returned Edwards. "I saw it and wondered about it at the time. But what happened immediately after made me forget. Now that you mention it, I remember distinctly." "Good. When you had gone back to Miss Hillgrove, I looked to see why my knife had refused to touch the snake's heart until I found the way between his shoulders. This package was fastened to Sonora Jack's breast under his shirt. This strap was over his shoulders to support it. This other strap was around his chest to hold the packet in place. Look, there are the marks of my knife. 3 times I struck there, and there, and there." The 2 white men exclaimed with amazement at the Indian's statement. "I think," said Natalie slowly, "that you would do well to see what this thing is that the stealer of little girls hid so carefully under his clothing and fastened so securely to his body." Hugh Edwards drew back with an appealing look at St. Jimmy, who took the packet from the Indian. "Must this thing be opened?" said Edwards. "Yes, Hugh, I think so," returned the doctor gently. "Anything else would hardly be fair to Marta, would it?" "No, I suppose not," answered Edwards with a groan. "All right, go ahead. You can tell me when you have finished." He turned away and went to the window, where he sat with his back towards St. Jimmy, who seated himself at the table. Natalie stood near the door with his arms folded as motionless as a statue. Undoing the lacing of the leather envelope, St. Jimmy found a number of newspaper clippings, so cut as to preserve the name and date line of the paper, several letters, and a diary with various entries under different dates, rather poorly written but legible. Swiftly he scanned the printed articles, the diary, and the letters he read with more care. Hugh Edwards was like a man condemned already in his own mind, awaiting the formality of the verdict. When Marta's birth and the character of her parents had been under a cloud, the man who was branded before the world a criminal had felt that their love was right, and that there was no obstacle to their marriage. He had reasoned, indeed, that their happiness would in a measure lighten the shadow that lay over the girl's life, and in a degree would atone for the injustice under which he himself had suffered, the unjust shame and humiliation that the girl had felt so keenly, the dishonor and shame that injustice had brought upon him, had been to them a common bond, while the knowledge of what each had innocently suffered, and the sympathy of each for the other, had deepened and strengthened their love. But as he listened to the dying Mexican's story, he saw the barrier that was being raised to his happiness with the girl he loved. Marta's birth and parentage were not, after all, what the old prospectors, St. Jimmy and Marta herself, had believed. What then was left to justify him in asking her to become the wife of a convict? If indeed her birth and name were without a shadow, how could he ask her to accept his name, dishonored as it was? And if it should be shown that her people were living, if they were people of importance and honor, how then could the convict who loved her ask her to share his life of dishonor? When the Mexican had been unable to give the name, hope had again risen in Edward's heart. But when Natalie brought the packet which Sonora Jack had treasured with such care, Hugh Edwards knew that it was only a matter of minutes until the identity of the woman he loved would be established, which meant that now he could never ask her to be his wife. St. Jimmy finished reading the papers and carefully placed them again in the leather envelope. To the watching Indian he seemed undecided. He had the air of one not quite sure of his hand. At last, looking up, he said slowly, "You are right, Natalie. This envelope completes the Mexican story and establishes the identity of the girl we have always known as Marta Hillgrove." End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Mine with the Iron Door by Harold Bell Wright. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Revelation. Natachi remembered. Hugh Edwards rose to his feet. "Well," he said desperately, "let's have it." St. Jimmy answered in an odd, musing tone. Marta, or Martha, for that is her name, was born in a little city in southwestern Missouri, in the lead and zinc mining district. Her parents were both held in the highest esteem in the community where their families had lived for 3 generations. About the time Marta was born, her father, who was a real estate speculator and trader on a rather small scale, purchased a tract of land from some people who could barely make a living on it. The land was hilly and stony and covered mostly with scrub oak, which made it almost worthless for farming, and the man and his wife were glad to get the usual market price for such property. But shortly after this same cheap farm land was developed as a very valuable mineral property, about the richest, in fact, in that district. Hugh Edwards interrupted. "Wait a minute. Did you learn all this just now from the contents of that package?" "No, Hugh. The fact is, I was born and grew up in that same Missouri town. It was the home of my people, and even after I went to St. Louis, I was in close touch with the old place. These papers here merely fill in some of the missing details of a story that I have known for years. I'm trying to tell it to you so that you will understand everything clearly." "Go on, please." When the property they had sold proved so valuable, the people who had been glad to receive the price they did for their supposedly worthless farmlands were very bitter. They considered themselves swindled, and being the sort they were, brooded over their fancied wrongs until they formed a plan of revenge. They stole the baby Martha. The plan of the kidnappers, as it is shown here, St. Jimmy touched the packet on the table, was to hold the little girl until her father had made a fortune from the mineral lands he had purchased from them, and then to force him to pay a large part of that wealth back to them as a ransom for the child. The man and woman with the baby traveled west by wagon. They always camped. When supplies were needed, the man would go alone to purchase them. They rarely entered a town except to pass through, and then, of course, took every precaution to hide the child. Their plan to extort money from the father led them to preserve carefully the evidence that would later prove the identity of the little girl. Their fears of arrest led them to conceal their own identity as carefully. It was more than a year later when they reached Tucson. The rest of the story we have heard. I should add that Marta's mother died 6 months after the baby was stolen. George Clinton, after his wife's death, sold his mining interests and moved to California. Hugh Edwards started forward. His face was ghastly. His lips trembled so that he could scarcely form the words. "George Clinton, did you say?" "Yes." "George Willard Clinton?" "Yes. Do you know of him?" Hugh Edwards, fighting for self-control, became very still. Turning his back on the others, he walked to the window and stood looking out. "Yes," he said at last, and his voice was steady now. "Yes, I know him. He lives in Los Angeles. I had heard that he was at one time interested in mines in Missouri, but of course I knew nothing of this story that you have told. He is a very wealthy man." "What a splendid thing for Marta!" exclaimed St. Jimmy. Hugh Edwards left the window and went to stand beside the body of the Mexican. "Yes, it will be very fine for her." And suddenly, as he stood looking down at the dead man, Hugh Edwards laughed. St. Jimmy sprang to his feet. Such laughter was not good to hear. "Hugh!" The man whirled on him. "You win, St. Jimmy. Congratulations." He rushed madly from the room. St. Jimmy gazed at Natachi, speechless with amazement. "What on earth did he mean by that?" he said at last. "Is it possible you do not know?" The other shook his head. Natachi said slowly, "When everybody believed that the woman Hugh Edwards loved was one who had no real right to even the name she bore. Then he could ask her to become his wife. Now that the woman is the daughter of honor and wealth, how can the convict expect her to go with him? Hugh Edwards is not blind. He sees it is now more fitting that the woman he loves become the wife of his friend St. Jimmy, upon whose name there is no shadow. But Natachi, with the cunning of his Indian nature, had not given St. Jimmy the whole truth in his explanation of Hugh Edwards' manner. Natachi remembered that the man who had promoted that investment company, and who had used his power as the president of the institution to rob the people of their savings, and who, to shield himself, had sent Donald Payne, an innocent man, to prison, was George Willard Clinton. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Mine with the Iron Door by Harold Bell Wright. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Gold. He saw that the need of gold is a curse, that the craving for gold is a greater curse, that the possession of gold may be the greatest curse of all. When Hugh Edwards left St. Jimmy and the Indian, he was beside himself with grief and rage. He had prepared himself in a measure to lose Marta. He had told himself that his love was strong enough to endure even that test, but to give her up because she proved to be the daughter of the man who, by making him a convict, had robbed him of the right to keep her, was more than he could endure. As he rushed blindly from the house that had been to him a house of refuge, but was now become a house of torment, Marta called to him. He did not stop. He must get away, away from them all, the old prospector, St. Jimmy, Natachi, Marta, the dead Mexican. They had all conspired with God to sink him in a hell of conflicting love and hatred. When he came to himself, he was at the cabin where he had made his home during those first months of his life in the Canyon of Gold, when he was seeking a place to hide, as a wild creature wounded by the hunters seeks to hide from the dogs. He had found that little cabin. He had learned to feel safe there, but he did not feel safe there now. The empty place was crowded with memories that would drive him to some deed of madness. It was there his dream of freedom and love had been born. It was there that the dear comradeship of the girl had led him to believe there might still be something to hope for, to work for, and to live for. He could not stay there now. The place was no longer a place where he could hide from his enemies. It was a trap, a snare. He must go, and go quickly. Without consciously willing his movements, indeed without realizing where he was going, he climbed out of the canyon and hurried away up the mountain slopes and along the ridges in the direction of Natachi's hut. With no clearly defined trail to follow, it is doubtful if in his normal mental state he could have found the place. He certainly would not have made the attempt, particularly at that time of day. But some subconscious memory must have guided him, for at sundown he found himself in the familiar gulch where he had toiled all through the winter for the gold that meant for him the realization of his dreams of freedom and happiness with Marta. When night came, he was seated on that spot from which he had so often, in the agony of those lonely months of hiding, watched the tiny point of light in the gloom of the canyon below. With his eyes fixed on that red spot which he knew was the window of Marta's room, Hugh Edwards brooded over the series of events that had ended in that hour of his dead hopes and broken dreams. His thoughts went back even to those glad days when he was graduated from his university, and when, with a heart of honest courage and purpose, he had accepted a position of trust in the institution that seemed to afford such an opportunity for service. He recalled every proud step of his advancement from office to office, of increasing responsibility. He lived again that appalling hour when he knew that he had been promoted only that he might be betrayed. Again he suffered the agony of his arrest, the trial with his baffled attempts to prove his innocence, the hideous publicity, the hatred of the people, and again he heard the sentence that condemned him to years in prison and to a life of dishonor and shame. Once more he endured the horror of a convict's life and the death of his mother. Then came the terrible experiences of his escape, when he was hunted as a wild beast is hunted with dogs and guns, And then the Canyon of Gold, with its promise of peace and safety, its blessed work and dreams and hopes, its miraculous gift of love. One by one the strange events of his life in the Canyon of Gold passed in review before him, the period when he lived in the cabin next door to the old prospectors and their partnership daughter, his comradeship with Marta, and the sure development of their love, the story of the girl's questionable parentage that had made it possible for him to think of her as his wife, then the visit of the sheriff, his enforced life of torment with the Indian, and his fruitless toil for the gold that held him with its promise of freedom and Marta. Again he lived over the coming of the outlaw with the sudden turn of fortune that made Natachi his ally, and gave him the gold from the mine with the iron door. And then with the gold in his possession, and all its promises almost within his grasp, the tragedy and disaster that had followed. Until now, having gained the wealth for which, inspired by love, he had toiled and fought, he had lost the thing which gave the gold its value. The thing for which he had wanted the gold had become impossible to him. The light in the Canyon of Gold went out. The hours passed, and still the man held his place on that wild spot high up in the mountains. And now he saw and felt the mysteries of the night, saw the wide sea of darkness that engulfed the vast desert below, and felt the whispering breath of the desert air, saw the mighty peaks and shoulders of the mountains lifting out of the dark shadows below, up and up and up into the starlit sky, and felt the fragrant coolness dropping from the pines that held the snows, saw the night sky filled with countless star worlds, and felt the brooding presence that fixes the time of their every movement and marks their paths of gleaming light, saw the black depths of the Canyon of Gold, and felt the ghostly multitude of the disappointed ones who had toiled there as he had toiled for the treasure they never found, or finding were cursed with its possession. And then, as one who in a vision glimpses the underlying truth of things, this man on the mountain heights above the Cañada del Oro saw that life itself was but a canyon of gold. As men through the ages had braved the dangers and endured the hardships of desert and mountains to gain the yellow wealth from the Cañada del Oro, so men braved dangers and endured hardships everywhere. Every dream of man was a dream of gold. Every effort was an effort for gold. Every hope was a hope for gold. For gold was life and honor and power and love and happiness, and gold was death and dishonor and murder and hatred and misery. It was gold that had led Marta's father to purchase the rich mining property from the ignorant owners for a price that was little more than nothing. The victims of George Clinton's shrewdness had stolen his child in the hope that by her they might regain the gold they had lost. It was for gold that Clinton had robbed the people who, because of their need for gold, had trusted him with their savings. To ensure himself in the possession of gold, Clinton had sent Donald Payne to prison and condemned him to a life of dishonor. Gold to the escaped convict had meant at first the bare necessities of life. It had come to mean everything for which a man desires to live. For gold, Sonora Jack had given himself to crime. Lured by the gold of the mine with the iron door, he had come to the Cañada del Oro and had been brought finally to his death. It was gold that had at last led to the revelations that brought the love of Hugh Edwards and Marta to naught. The man saw that the story of his life in the Canyon of Gold, with its needs, its hopes, its labors, its fears, its victories and defeats, was the story of all life everywhere. He saw that the need of gold is a curse, that the craving for gold is a greater curse, that the possession of gold may be the greatest curse of all. When Hugh Edwards went down to the cabin, he found Natachi the Indian waiting for him. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of The Mine with the Iron Door by Harold Bell Wright. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Morning. The heart of a white man is a strange thing. I, Natachi, cannot understand. And Hugh Edwards knew by the light that flashed in the Indian's somber eyes, by the expression of that dark countenance, and by the proud bearing of the red man, that Natachi had put aside the teaching of the white man's school. There was something, too, beneath the Indian's stoical composure, which told Hugh that he was under the strain of some great excitement. Gazing at Edwards with a curious intentness, the Indian said, "My friend has been watching his star in the Canyon of Gold." "Yes, Natachi, I've been up on the mountain." Silently the Indian gave him a letter. It was from Martha. Hugh handled the letter, turning it over and over, as if debating with himself what he should do with it. "Open it and read," said the Indian. "Then hear what I, Natachi, shall say." Edwards opened the letter and read. It was not a long letter, but it was filled with the strongest assurances of understanding and sympathy that a woman's loving heart could pen. St. Jimmy had told her of the completion of the story that had been left unfinished by the Mexican, and had explained its effect on the man she loved. But it made no difference to her that she was proved to be the daughter of George Clinton, except that she was glad for her future husband's sake that her birth was honorable, that she was not nameless as she had believed herself to be. For the rest, everything must go on exactly as if she were still the old prospector's partnership girl. St. Jimmy had gone to complete the arrangements he had started to make when Sonora Jack carried her away. There must be no change in their plans. When they were safe out of the country, she could communicate with her father. Hugh must come for her at once. She would be waiting for him tomorrow morning. With deliberate care, Hugh Edwards folded the letter and returned it to the envelope. The Indian was watching him intently. The man did not appear in any way surprised, elated, or disturbed. One would have said that he had been expecting the letter, had foreseen its contents, and had already in his mind answered it. His manner was that of one who, having fought and lived through the crisis of a storm, methodically and wearily takes up again the routine duties of his existence. Calmly, with a shadowy smile that would have caused Martha to think of St. Jimmy, he spoke. "What is it that you wish to say, Natachi?" "I, Natachi the Indian, can now pay the debt I owe Hugh Edwards." "You have more than paid that debt, Natachi," the red man returned haughtily. "Is the life of Natachi of such little value that it is paid for by the death of that snake, Sonora Jack, and his companion who stopped the arrow?" "But for you, Martha would not have escaped from Sonora Jack and the other outlaws," returned Edwards. "But for me, no one would know the woman Hugh Edwards loves, except as the Pardner's girl. Hugh Edwards, but for Natachi, would be free to make her his wife." Indicating the letter in his hand, Hugh answered, "She says here that it need make no difference. She says for me to come as if the Mexican had died without speaking, as if you had taken nothing from Sonora Jack." The Indian's eyes blazed with triumph. "Good! That is as I, Natachi, wanted it to be. Now the way of my friend to the great desire of his heart is clear. Listen, when you left so hurriedly, after hearing the name of the girl's father, Dr. Burton wondered at your manner. I told him that now when the girl was known to be the daughter of a man of wealth and honorable position, you felt you could not take her for your wife." "That was true enough," returned Edwards, wondering at the excitement which the Indian, with all his assumed composure, could not hide. "Yes, but I did not tell anyone that it was the girl's father who sent you, my friend, to prison. No one but Hugh Edwards and Natachi knows that. No one shall know until you, Donald Payne, are revenged for all that this man Clinton has made you suffer. When you have trapped this Clinton coyote, when you have made him pay for your shame, your imprisonment, your mother's death, when he has paid for everything your heart holds against him, then I, Natachi, will have paid my debt to you." Hugh Edwards gazed at the Indian, bewildered, amazed, wondering. "What on earth do you mean, Natachi? Do you not understand? Listen. The girl, who does not know what her father did, will go with you. Good. Take her. Let there be a pretense of marriage. Then, when her shame is accomplished, send her to her father. Let George Clinton, who made Donald Payne a convict, beg that convict to give his daughter a name for her children. The shame that he heaped upon your name, the dishonor that he compelled you to suffer, you will give back to him through his daughter." The white man exclaimed with horror, "In God's name, stop! Is not the heart of Donald Payne filled with hate for the man who has filled his life with suffering? Yes, Natachi, I hate George Clinton, but you will not take the revenge that I, Nataji, have planned for you. No, no, no. The heart of a white man is a strange thing, returned the Indian. I, Natachi, cannot understand. The sun was not yet above the mountains, but the sky was glorious with the beauty of the new day when Hugh Edwards stood in the doorway of the Indian's hut. Against a sky of liquid gold, melting into the deeper blue above, wreaths of flaming crimson cloud mists were flung with the careless splendor of the artist who paints with the brush of the wind and the colors of light on the canvas of the heavens. The man bared his head and with face uplifted watched. He felt the soft breath of the spring on his neck and caught the perfume of cedar and pine. He heard the birds singing among the blossoms on the mountainside. He saw the mighty peaks and crags towering high. He looked down upon the foothills and mesas and afar over the desert where gray-blue shadows drifted on a sea of color into the far purple distance. A squirrel in a live oak nearby chattered a glad good morning. A buck stepped from the cover of a manzanita thicket and stood for a moment with antlered head lifted as if he too sensed the beauty and the meaning of life. A timid doe came to stand beside her lordly mate. The man, motionless, held his breath. In a flash they were gone. Natachi, the Indian, stood beside his white companion. Hugh Edwards held out his hand to the red man. Goodbye, Natachi. You go? Asked the puzzled Indian. Yes, you have paid your debt, Natachi. The fire of savage exultation flamed in the red man's eyes. Hugh Edwards will take the revenge that I, Natachi, have offered. No. The Indian said doubtfully, as if striving for an answer to the thing which puzzled him so. There is something in the white man's heart that is more than hate. Yes, Natachi, yesterday I believed that there was nothing left for me in life but hate. Then you last night revealed to me what hate might do, and I knew the strength of love. I must go now to the woman who is waiting for me down there in the Canyon of Gold. But Hugh Edwards, when he told St. Jimmy that George Clinton was living, had been mistaken. The very night that Nataji brought the girl from that place where Sonora Jack had taken her, Marta's father died in a Los Angeles hospital. In the same hour that the Indian and the girl were stealing from the Mexican house south of the border, the man for whose crime Donald Payne was sent to prison was dictating a confession. With the last of his strength he signed the instrument. Natachi, when he offered to Hugh Edwards his scheme of revenge, did not know that at that very moment every newspaper in the land was heralding the innocence of the escaped convict Donald Payne. The man who went down the mountain slopes and ridges toward the Canyon of Gold that morning did not know that he was even then a free man. The girl who waited for her lover, who had never spoken to her of his love, did not know. But Dr. Burton, when he went to Oracle that evening before to complete his arrangements for that wedding journey, had received the news. It was like St. Jimmy to meet Hugh Edwards on the mountainside that morning, and to tell him what he had learned before Hugh had come within sight of the house in the canyon. It was like St. Jimmy, too, to suggest that perhaps now Marta need never know, at least not until after they had returned from their trip abroad. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Mine with the Iron Door by Harold Bell Wright. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Freedom. It was the plan that had been arranged by St. Jimmy. Late in the afternoon of that appointed day, an automobile from Tucson turned off from the Bankhead Highway into the old road that leads to the Cañada del Oro. At the point where the road enters the Canyon of Gold, which is as far as an automobile can go on that ancient trail, Hugh and Marta, with old Thad, were waiting. The automobile would take them without a stop, straight south through Tucson to Nogales, where they would cross the international boundary line into Nogales, Mexico. From there, immediately after the wedding ceremony, Donald Payne and his bride would travel by rail to Mexico City, from which point, in due time, they would go to the lands of the Old World. Thad would return to the Cañada del Oro, and would for a while at least make his home with St. Jimmy and Mother Burton. It was the plan that had been arranged by St. Jimmy when they all believed that it was unsafe for Hugh to make his real name known in the United States. For Marta's sake, the original plan was still to be carried out. When Marta and her husband were safely out of the country and on their way abroad, Dr. Burton would give the facts to the newspapers. In a few months, the sensational story would cease to be of news interest to the press and would be forgotten by the public. Then Marta would be told that her husband's innocence had been established, that Donald Payne, no longer a fugitive from prison, was free to return again to his own country. St. Jimmy and his mother had said their goodbyes at the little home of the old prospectors and their partnership girl. From a rocky point on Samaniego Ridge, high above the Canyon of Gold, Natachi the Indian saw the black moving spot, which was the automobile on the old trail that had been followed by so many peoples in so many ages. Motionless as a figure of stone, with a face unmoved, the red man watched. The automobile stopped. The dark eyes of the Indian, trained to such distance, could see, as no white man could have seen, the three figures entering the machine. The automobile moved away, winding down through the foothills, crawling cautiously over the ridges, laboring heavily across the sandy washes, growing smaller and smaller, until even to the Indian's vision it was lost in the gray-brown plain of the desert. But still Natachi's gaze held toward the south, where presently he saw a faint cloud of dust rising from the yellow thread-like line of highway. Then the cloud of dust melted into the desert air. A moment longer the Indian watched. Then slowly his gaze swept the many miles that lie between the foot of the Santa Catalinas and the far horizon. A puff of air, fragrant with the scent of the desert, stirred the single feather that drooped from the loosely twisted folds of the Indian's headband. In the blue depth of the sky, a wheeling eagle screamed, lifting his dark face toward the mountain peaks that towered above his lonely hut. Natachi the Indian, mystic guardian of the mine with the iron door, smiled. The end. End of chapter 35. End of The Mine with the Iron Door by Harold Bell Wright.